A&P1 students at Madison Area Technical College. This is Gina Piscatelli with Endocrine System Lecture number 1. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the general structure and function of the endocrine system as a whole. And then in part 2, we talk about hormones and their characteristics. This information can be found in your textbook, Chapter 16, Sections 1 through 6, and pertinent details that you need to know are listed in Study Questions 1 through 5. I did give this lecture live yesterday on Monday, April 20th, but I can't find the recording. It's out in the cloud somewhere, so I'm redoing it. So the general structure and function of the endocrine system is that glands or any other tissues and cells secreting hormones function to regulate other organ systems. So an endocrine gland will make a hormone that controls another organ in a different organ system. So key to the endocrine system's function is communication from cell to cell, and this of course is done with hormones. The different endocrine organs that exist in our body include the thyroid gland, the thymus, the pancreas, the adrenal glands. The testicle makes testosterone and the ovaries make estrogen and progesterone. And then behind the thyroid gland, posterior view here, we have some little tiny groups of cells, 4 of them, called parathyroid glands. And those will be important for calcium regulation. In addition, part of the brain makes hormones. The hypothalamus, which is this triangular region down here, makes some hormones. The pineal gland makes some hormones, and the pituitary gland, I don't know if you want to consider that part of the brain or not. We'll talk about it more in the next lecture, but that also makes some hormones. So recall that endocrine glands are what we call ductless. That means they secrete their substances, which are hormones, directly into the bloodstream. That's in contrast to an exocrine gland, whose cells secrete substances into a duct, and then the substance reaches whatever organ it's supposed to go to through that duct. So by definition, a hormone is a chemical signal transported by the bloodstream to a target organ. So on this side of the picture, we have some beige looking cells that are making a hormone that's green. It's transported directly into the blood and travels a great distance usually to target cells, which are shown on the right side of the picture. And for the target cells to respond, the hormone has to exit the bloodstream and bind to a receptor on a target cell. So the next topic we're going to discuss are receptors on target cells. So this picture shows an endocrine cell as the secreting cell, secreting the blue hormone into the bloodstream. Because the blood goes throughout the entire body, this hormone can exit at various spots throughout your body, and therefore many cells are exposed to the hormone. Notice this group of 3 cells are all exposed to the little blue hormone. However, the only one that can respond, the only true target cell, is the one that has a receptor that the hormone fits into. This cell right here, I just put a check mark on it, has a receptor, but the receptor is not specific for the hormone. Now another thing to think about in terms of receptors on target cells is that there may be more than one type of receptor that can bind to a hormone. So this target cell has two receptors, kind of a green one and an orange one, that both can respond to this hormone or bind to that hormone. But different things might happen depending on which receptor the hormone binds to. So the sources of hormones include all those glands that I listed before and we looked at a picture of. But there are many organs and tissues in your body that also make communication molecules that travel in the blood, make hormones. The heart, for example, makes a hormone called ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. What it means is sodium is secreted in the urine and it reduces blood volume. But the heart makes a hormone. The small intestine makes a couple of hormones. Bones make hormones, adipose, stomach, and the list goes on and on and on. So any tissue or cell that secretes a signaling molecule directly into the blood that will target another cell is considered maybe an endocrine cell. The next thing we need to look at is what stimulates the release of a hormone, the secretion, and then the release of a hormone from an endocrine cell. And there's three ways that hormone release is stimulated. The first way I have listed here is the humoral stimulus. The second is a neural stimulus, that'd be from a nerve. And another is a hormonal stimulus. So let's first talk about what a humoral stimulus is. Humor is an ancient word for a fluid in the body. So a humor is a fluid. You might have heard of the humors of the body. So fluids. Oh boy, look at that F. Sorry about that. Okay, fluids. And the fluid will contain certain substances like ions, nutrients, hormones, anything, temperature. And so if there's something in that blood, and we usually only consider blood fluids, if there's something in the blood that could trigger a hormone release, then it would be considered a humoral stimulus. And I'm going to go and show you an example of that right now and then come back to the neural stimulus. So here's an example of a humoral stimulus. And what it is hypocalcemia, low blood calcium. So if there's not enough calcium in the blood, that makes the functioning of nerve cells as well as muscle cells inadequate. So we need to have a high enough blood calcium for those things to work. Well, in response to low blood calcium, the parathyroid glands secrete a hormone, not surprisingly, called parathyroid hormone. And what that parathyroid hormone will do is target the bone to break down the minerals it has and release the calcium into the blood. So right away that increases blood calcium level. But in addition, parathyroid hormone can act on our intestines to make sure that any dietary calcium we eat is absorbed into the bloodstream. And it also acts on the kidney to make sure that no calcium leaves with the urine. So the kidney will reabsorb any calcium and not let it go into our waste, the urine. So that's an example of a humoral stimulus. Now let's look at a neural stimulus. This is just a neuron stimulating an endocrine cell to make a hormone. So the nervous system stimulates it. And I picked a sympathetic neuron. So a sympathetic nervous system causes the adrenal medulla, and this is the medulla of the adrenal gland right here, to make a hormone that goes right into the blood. And that hormone is epinephrine. And I know we're kind of used to thinking of epinephrine as a neurotransmitter, but it can also be a hormone when it is secreted by an endocrine gland into the bloodstream. So the targets of epinephrine will be the heart, the pupil, and airways, and many other things. Anything with the sympathetic nervous system affects, usually epinephrine does as well. So you'll get an increased heart rate, the pupil will dilate, and bronchodilation to ensure that you are breathing enough air, passing enough air into your lungs. So the bottom line is that your body is prepared for increased activity. So this is a nerve fiber that's the stimulus. Now I'll go back up to the last way that we can stimulate hormone release is by another hormone. So we would call this kind of stimulus a releasing or an inhibiting hormone because it acts directly on an endocrine gland to either cause it to release a hormone or inhibiting it from releasing a hormone. So let me give you an example of that. So an example of this would be the pituitary gland hormones. So the pituitary gland hormones, there's a lot of them, but I've got 3 listed here. One pituitary gland hormone is thyroid stimulating hormone. Another is adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then this third one is luteinizing hormone. All 3 of these anterior pituitary hormones are going to act on another endocrine gland. Thyroid stimulating hormone acts on the thyroid gland to make it release thyroid hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone acts on the adrenal cortex, which is the surface of the adrenal gland here, to make cortisol. That's one of our stress hormones. And then luteinizing hormone can act on the testis and the ovaries, and it causes the testis to release testosterone. So for now, without understanding what the final effects of these hormones are, I think you can at least see that one hormone stimulated an endocrine gland to release another hormone. Often what we see when there's a hormonal stimulus to an endocrine gland, directing it to release or stop releasing a hormone, we often see this control mechanism called feedback inhibition. And I've got an example here. We're not going to worry about the top just yet, but let's just deal with the pituitary gland and the thyroid gland. So the pituitary gland, as I mentioned before, releases thyroid stimulating hormone, causing the thyroid gland to make thyroid hormone. So now there's a higher level of thyroid hormone in the blood. That travels throughout the body, and the anterior pituitary can respond to the level of thyroid hormone, and if there's enough, it will stop making TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. So we call this negative feedback inhibition. That's what we call it. And so thyroid hormone controls its own production, so to speak, or secretion through negative feedback inhibition right here. Now another part of this picture shows the hypothalamus up here. And the hypothalamus also releases a hormone, but this hormone stimulates the anterior pituitary. It's called a thyrotropic releasing hormone. So it's a thyrotropic releasing hormone, and it causes the pituitary to make a thyrotropin, TSH, which causes the thyroid gland to make thyroid hormone. The only reason I'm bringing this up now is because thyroid hormone levels would also inhibit the hypothalamus. So those are all the ways that a hormone can be stimulated and or inhibited. Let's look at the structure of hormones now. There's 2 basic categories of chemical molecules that hormones are made up of. One is that they might be amino acid based or protein based, and the other is steroid. A steroid is a lipid, if you recall. So you also might recall that these two categories vary on whether or not they like or dislike water. So this one is hydrophilic. Anything that's amino acid base is hydrophilic. The steroids, since they're lipids, are hydrophobic, and I'm just going to go abbreviate it here because I'm taking too long to write with my mouse. I'm trying to be neat. So, does not like water. So there's a lot of hormones that are amino acid based. We've got quite a long list here. There's just a few that are steroid based, and some of them might sound familiar to you, like testosterone is a steroid, progesterone is a steroid, aldosterone. This ONE ending is a tip-off that it's a steroid. Another tip-off is the OL at the end. Cortisol and calcitriol, those are steroid hormones. Now estrogen is the one that doesn't fit, but really estrogen is a composite of many different molecules, the predominant one being estradiol. And so now the nomenclature thing works. So estradiol has an OL at the end. That's really the active part of estrogens. So here are some examples of amino acid based hormones and steroid hormones. I'll first look at the amino acid based ones. Oxytocin you've probably heard of. That's important during delivery of a baby. And ADH is antidiuretic hormone, and it reduces the amount of urine that we make. It helps us retain water. And then epinephrine, which I discussed before, made by the adrenal gland, stimulates our body to be ready for physical activity. So all of these are amino acid based hormones, and their nomenclature really doesn't tell you that. But steroid hormones should. So these are two examples of steroid hormones that are hydrophobic. They do not like water. One is testosterone, and one is estradiol. And then the nomenclature thing works. And just as, I guess, a foreshadowing, if we think about hormones that are hydrophilic versus those that are hydrophobic, we want to think about how they would interact with the cell membrane of their target cell. If they're hydrophilic, they cannot get into the cell. They can't. They are going to have to bind to a receptor that's on the surface of the cell. But a hydrophobic hormone is going to be able to get directly into the cell because it'll squeeze through the phospholipid membrane, and the receptor will be on the inside. We'll talk about that again in a bit. So also another consideration for these two categories of hormones is how in the world are we going to transport the hormones in this aqueous environment, which is the blood. The blood plasma is primarily made up of water, when the steroid hormones are hydrophobic. They don't even like water. So we're going to look at how that is accomplished by both types. So the amino acid based hormones that are hydrophilic, they have no problem. They are freely suspended individually in the blood plasma, and that the square is supposed to indicate an amino acid or hydrophilic hormone. There is one exception though, and that's thyroid hormone. It needs a transport protein because otherwise it clumps up together, much like hydrophobic hormones do. So if we had hydrophobic hormones individually suspended without a transport protein in the blood, they would clump up together because that's how hydrophobic molecules organize in water. They get clumped up. So instead, they're bound to transport proteins in the plasma, and that's the green molecule shown in the lower left picture. So steroid hormones and thyroid hormones will need a transport protein. Some examples of transport proteins are albumin and globulins. They're made by the liver, so if the liver is diseased and can't make these, it will be very difficult to transport hydrophobic hormones or steroid hormones. Okay, so let's talk about receptors again with these two different types. The green hormone is an amino acid based hormone or a peptide hormone, and it's hydrophilic, and so it cannot get across the cell membrane. It can't. It has to bind to a cell surface or cell membrane receptor. The hydrophobic ligand, which are the steroids, or lipids in general, but steroids, they, especially if they're small enough, and they tend to be, they can get across the cell membrane and they bind to an intracellular receptor. This intracellular receptor could be in the cytoplasm or it could be in the nucleus. It could be anywhere in the cell. Okay, let's look at just a summary of what we know about hormones traveling in the bloodstream, binding to a receptor, and then we're going to add one thing, and that is, what is the action? What is the action of the hormone on a target cell? So, first we have the peptide hormone. It's freely suspended. It binds to a cell surface receptor. And now what is it going to do in this target cell? This is the target cell. Well, it has to activate a second messenger inside the cytoplasm for anything to happen. And for anything to happen, these second messengers are often calcium or cyclic AMP. Whoa, it's very big. Cyclic AMP. So those are the second messengers that a peptide hormone will activate in a target cell. On the other hand, we have these steroid receptors that are bound to transport proteins. They do release from the transport proteins, exit the blood, go through a target cell membrane, and then bind to a receptor on the inside. Often the receptor is DNA or something attached to DNA. And so the action of a steroid hormone is to regulate gene transcription. It will either turn on a gene, so now you will get transcription, or turn off a gene, and then you wouldn't. So here's an example of steroid hormones and how thyroid hormone works to regulate gene transcription. The steroid hormone has left the blood and its transport protein behind. It wiggles through the cell surface or the cell membrane, and then it can go through the nuclear membrane or a nuclear pore, and it reaches the location. Here's a receptor here, or the receptor could be inside here, could be either place. And then together the receptor and the hormone bind to the DNA, and this might either enhance transcription or inhibit transcription. This particular picture shows that the yellow hormone has enabled transcription to take place. So this is our messenger RNA, And so now a new protein is going to be made by the ribosomes in response to that original hormone binding to its receptor. Amino acid based hormones or peptide hormones use this second messenger system. Often it's cyclic AMP, and you've seen this before, but it's never less complicated the second time, maybe by the 10th time. So we'll go through this idea of cyclic AMP being initiated by a cell surface receptor. So first, the peptide hormone binds to the cell surface receptor. That's number one. That process of binding activates a neighboring protein called G protein, listed right here. So G protein is activated, and it can move within the membrane, and what it does is it activates a neighboring enzyme or protein. In this case, it's called adenylate cyclase. And what adenylate cyclase does is it converts ATP to cyclic AMP, which is shown right here. So now we have the second messenger, cyclic AMP. So that's the initial effect of a peptide hormone, is that a second messenger has been created because the receptor was linked to this G protein that activates that process. But so what? So now we have cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP does a lot of things, but one of the major things it does is it activates other enzymes. For example, there's an enzyme group called kinases. Kinases phosphorylate proteins, which in and of themselves might be enzymes. But cyclic AMP is able to activate this kinase. So protein kinases then activate lots of enzymes in the target cells. So there's a lot of different effects that can happen. Chemical reactions will take place. Maybe a cell will secrete something in response. Maybe an ion channel will open. It depends on the target cell and the genes that are being expressed in that particular target cell. I'll show you one example with epinephrine. So epinephrine is an amino acid hormone, and it uses cyclic AMP as a second messenger. So here we have the hormone epinephrine binding to its cell surface receptor. That activates the neighboring G protein, which activates adenylyl cyclase, and now we get our second messenger, cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP activates a specific protein kinase A, which has the action of inhibiting glycogen synthesis. This is in the liver, sorry, this is a liver cell. The target cell is a liver cell. That's important. I mean, if I'm really going to give you an example, I should make it more concrete. So a liver cell. So cyclic AMP activates protein kinase A in the liver cell. That makes the liver stop making glycogen and makes the liver cell break down glycogen. Both of these things will increase blood glucose. So epinephrine, in response to epinephrine, I should say, the liver cell floods the blood with glucose, which only makes sense. You're going to need a lot of glucose to flee or fight when you're threatened, which is when epinephrine's released. Okay, the last few things aren't nearly as difficult. We went through the hard stuff. Let's first just talk about how long does it take to see the effects of the hormone and how long do those effects last. And it differs for which type of hormone. So the onset could be right away. You could see the effects, or it could take days to see the effects. Typically, amino acid based hormones, you will see their effects on a cell quickly, whereas steroid hormones, it will take some time. And the reasoning behind that, as far as anybody's ever explained, is that it takes time for gene transcription, translation, and folding of a protein so that it's functional to take place. So that takes more time. But the duration is very short for amino acid hormones, and very long for steroid hormones. So there's a trade-off. If you want to have a long-lasting effect, steroid hormones work best. And it's related to which receptor mechanism each of these use, but it's also related to how well we clear that hormone from our blood. So kidneys are always filtering our blood, and hormones get broken down and cleared from our bloodstream periodically. And it takes longer to clear steroids from the blood. And also steroids have a longer half-life, so they'll just live in the blood longer and still be functional. Okay, let's do a review. And I'll read these questions to you, but I guess you don't really need me to. But there are 3 hormones that help the liver maintain blood glucose levels, either by having the liver synthesize glycogen or break down glycogen. These hormones are insulin, glucagon, and cortisol. So there's 3 hormones made by the body that act on the liver. How many receptors does a liver cell need to respond to each one of these hormones? Meaning, can it use one receptor for all 3? Can it use one receptor for 2 of them and then another receptor for the 3rd? Or does each hormone need an individual receptor? And the answer is each hormone needs an individual receptor, so we'd need 3 receptors on that liver cell. Okay, number 2. Which system or process can change the heart rate the most quickly? The somatic nervous system, autonomic nervous system when it releases acetylcholine, the autonomic nervous system when it releases epinephrine, or the endocrine system by releasing adrenal epinephrine. So I want to change this to increase the heart rate most quickly. Oops, so that takes out B because that would lower the heart rate. The somatic nervous system doesn't even innervate the heart, so that's not an option. And then you're left with C versus D. Okay, this is a peptide hormone. This is the same peptide. This is a peptide neurotransmitter, and this is a peptide hormone. So the real question is, does the nervous system or the endocrine system act quicker? And the answer is the autonomic nervous system, through the release of epinephrine, acts the quickest. So your answer is C. Okay, number 3. Receptors for steroid hormones are commonly located where? Inside the target cell, on the plasma membrane, in the blood plasma, or in the extracellular fluid. And the answer, of course, is inside the target cell. One more slide. When a hormone interacts with a cell membrane receptor, the hormonal signal is converted to what? An intracellular depolarization, gene activation, second messenger, or endocytosis. And of course, the answer is second messenger. That one wasn't too hard. Okay, let's look at number 5. When blood glucose goes up, the pancreas responds by making insulin. This is an example of an endocrine gland, the pancreas, being activated by which mechanism? Neural stimulation, negative feedback, hormonal stimulation, or humoral stimulation. And the answer is humoral stimulation. And number 6, the last one, blood levels of hormones are kept within very narrow ranges by processes or a process called what? And we call it negative feedback mechanism. So that's it for the first endocrine system lecture. Thank you.